Ava Williams stood at the entrance of Terminal 4, her heels clicking against the polished floor as the crowd bustled around her. The usual rhythm of airport life was in full swing. People hurrying to their gates, the sound of overhead announcements, the constant flow of rolling suitcases. But for Ava, today wasn't like any other. She had just finished a high-stakes meeting with a corporate partner and was on her way to New York for a follow-up. Her posture was tall, confident, and her gaze steady. She was a woman who knew her worth, the kind of person who commanded respect without having to ask for it. But today, as she walked past the security check, the unexpected happened. Without warning, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am. We need to ask you a few questions." She turned to find two officers standing behind her, one of them looking at her with a cold, calculating gaze. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. The officer, a tall man with a stony face, didn't reply immediately. Instead, he glanced at his partner, who was busy scanning her luggage. "You're being detained for questioning. Please step aside." Ava's heart didn't race. She wasn't afraid. She knew her rights. But she did feel a flicker of irritation. The officer's eyes had scanned her quickly, a look that lingered on her skin and the sharp lines of her suit, and it was clear this wasn't a random stop. "I'm not sure what this is about, but I have a flight to catch," Ava said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we'll need to ask you to come with us." He didn't raise his voice, but the order was firm. Ava knew she could stand her ground, but something about the way he spoke, the dismissive tone, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about security protocols. This was about something else. As they walked towards a quieter corner of the terminal, Ava's mind raced. She had faced discrimination before, subtle glances, the occasional snide remark. But this was different. It was almost as if they thought she didn't belong in a place like this. First class, a businesswoman on the go. She couldn't shake the feeling that this had everything to do with the color of her skin, nothing more, nothing less. The officers asked her to place her belongings on the table and opened her bag. She watched as they sifted through her things, papers, her laptop, business cards, and felt the familiar sting of being judged for something she couldn't control. As the officer rummaged through her bag, his hand brushed against something that made him pause. It wasn't anything incriminating, just a travel book and a pen, but it was enough for him to look up and meet her gaze. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. Ava didn't flinch. She had been here before, in situations where people underestimated her, where her value wasn't seen right away. She had faced these moments and turned them into stepping stones every time. But this was different. She wasn't about to let them ruin her day, not when she knew the truth they didn't. "I'm not sure what you're looking for, but I'll be happy to explain anything if you give me a moment," she said. The officer, now slightly on edge, cleared his throat. "We'll need you to come with us, ma'am." He gestured for her to follow him down a narrow hallway. Ava didn't move. She took a slow breath, then smiled, a calm, composed smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you've made a mistake," she said. The officer raised an eyebrow, still not understanding. "Who are you, ma'am?" Ava's smile widened, a glint of something almost amused in her eyes. "I'm Ava Williams," she said, pulling out her phone and showing him the screen. The officer's eyes scanned the name for a moment. "I'm the CEO of Williams Financial," she added, her voice still steady. "And I think it's time for you to call your supervisor." The officer's face shifted. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, he looked uncomfortable. Ava's identity as a high-ranking executive wasn't just some detail. It was the truth, one that would make him rethink his assumptions. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am." The officer stammered, clearly rattled now. He glanced at his partner, who was staring at the phone screen in disbelief. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "It's fine," she said, her tone even. "But next time, remember, assumptions don't belong in this airport." Ava stood still as the officer hesitated, still holding her phone. The once confident air of authority that the officer had carried with him had all but evaporated. The noise of the terminal seemed distant now, fading into the background as Ava's calm voice cut through the tense silence between them. She could feel the eyes of nearby travelers on her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. A few passengers had paused their conversations, watching the scene unfold, wondering what would happen next. Ava remained poised, not out of arrogance, but because she knew her worth. She had learned long ago that composure was the most powerful tool in moments like this. "You may want to call your supervisor," she repeated, this time with more weight in her words. The officer nodded stiffly, his gaze shifting between Ava and his partner. Without saying a word, he turned and walked toward the terminal's security office, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Ava stayed in place, her eyes focused on the spot where he had disappeared. She didn't feel anger, not anymore. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of resolve, the kind of strength that came from knowing that she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated, misjudged, or overlooked because of the color of their skin. A few minutes passed, and Ava could see the officer returning, now accompanied by a second officer, this one older, with a more authoritative air about him. His badge gleamed in the harsh airport lights. He was likely the supervisor, and Ava could see that he wasn't quite sure how to approach the situation. The younger officer spoke first, his voice apologetic but unsure. "Ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience. There was a misunderstanding." Ava nodded, her expression neutral. "I understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But it's important that we all remember to treat each other with respect, regardless of assumptions." The supervisor nodded, a faint trace of regret crossing his face. "Of course, ma'am. We are very sorry." Ava could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't done yet. She knew that her actions could teach a lesson, not just for the officers, but for everyone watching. "I appreciate the apology," she said, pausing for a moment to let the words sink in. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. People are often judged by their appearance, and it's time we all start doing better." The supervisor opened his mouth to respond, but Ava held up a hand, stopping him. "It's not just about being sorry," she continued, her voice steady. "It's about creating an environment where people aren't treated like criminals based on their skin color. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." There was a long pause, the silence in the terminal stretching out before them. The supervisor seemed to understand, his eyes softening slightly as he nodded. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. Thank you for your patience." Ava gave a small nod in return. She didn't need their apology, but it was a start. She knew the importance of standing up in moments like these. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. With a final glance, Ava picked up her things, slinging her bag over her shoulder. She could hear the supervisor speaking to his officers as she turned to walk away. But this time, she wasn't just another person moving through the crowd. She had made her point. She had reminded them that power wasn't just about the badge or the uniform. It was about respect. And with that, she walked toward her gate, head held high, knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be yourself. Ava's footsteps echoed softly as she walked toward her gate, the distant hum of the airport now a background to the events that had just unfolded. She felt a quiet satisfaction in the air, a sense of peace that came from knowing she had stood her ground. But as she passed through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the way people looked at her. Some avoided her gaze, while others watched her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Ava knew that the scene with the officers had made an impression, not just on the two officers involved, but on the people who had witnessed it. She had shown them a different way of handling things, one that didn't rely on fear or intimidation, but on confidence and respect. It wasn't just about the apology or the mistake being acknowledged. It was about changing the narrative for everyone who had ever felt like an outsider in a place they were entitled to be. As Ava sat down at her gate, she pulled out her phone and checked her messages. The screen lit up with a few new notifications, but one message caught her attention. It was from a colleague at work, someone she hadn't spoken to in a while. The message simply read, "Saw what happened at the airport. Just wanted to say thank you for handling that with such grace. You inspire us all." Ava smiled to herself, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. She wasn't in this for recognition, but moments like this reminded her why she kept pushing forward, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. It wasn't just about being the best in her field or making deals. It was about making sure that the space she occupied, and the spaces others like her occupied, were places of equality. The flight attendants began calling for passengers to board, and Ava stood up, slipping her phone back into her bag. As she made her way toward the gate, she noticed a few more heads turning her way, but this time, it wasn't in judgment. There was a shift in the energy around her, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of respect that came from witnessing someone stand up for themselves in a world that often tried to push them down. She didn't feel the need to explain herself to anyone. The actions she had taken earlier spoke for themselves. She boarded the plane with a sense of quiet pride, settling into her seat and fastening her seatbelt. As the aircraft began to taxi down the runway, Ava looked out the window, watching the ground grow smaller beneath her. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had fought to get to this point in her career and in her life. But more than that, she thought about the people who would come after her, the women and men who would walk through the doors of that airport, or any airport, and not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Ava knew that as much as she had changed things today, there was still work to be done. But in that moment, she was content knowing that she had made a small but meaningful difference, and that, in itself, was enough. Ava leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed as the plane ascended into the sky. The soft hum of the engines was a familiar sound, one that she had grown used to over the years. It was a sound that marked the beginning of every journey, both literal and metaphorical. She thought about the events that had transpired earlier that day, the tension in the terminal, the uncertainty she had felt when those officers stopped her. But now, as the city below shrank into the distance, she felt a sense of relief. The immediate danger had passed, and the flight ahead promised a brief moment of peace. Her mind wandered to the larger picture, the path she had walked to get to this point. It hadn't been easy. There had been countless obstacles, moments of doubt, and people who tried to stand in her way simply because of the color of her skin. Ava had spent years fighting for her place in a world that wasn't always welcoming to people like her. She had worked harder than most, had to prove herself time and time again, and yet, there were still moments where she was reminded that some people saw her as less than. But today, something had shifted. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't even just about the officers. It was about the quiet ripple of change that she had set in motion. Ava thought about the people who had witnessed her stand up for herself, the passengers in the terminal who had been watching when the officers apologized, the ones who would leave the airport with a different perspective. She knew that change didn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Sometimes, it came from small acts of defiance, quiet but resolute, that slowly chipped away at the walls of prejudice and assumption. The flight attendants passed by, offering drinks and snacks, but Ava declined. She wasn't hungry. Instead, she turned her attention to the window, watching as the clouds parted to reveal the sprawling city below. The contrast between the calm above and the chaos below wasn't lost on her. It felt like a metaphor for the struggle she faced every day, trying to rise above the noise, to find clarity in the midst of confusion. As the plane leveled off, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the estimated time of arrival. Ava listened, but didn't really hear the words. Her thoughts were too far ahead, focused on the work she had ahead of her in New York. She would meet with investors, discuss new projects, and make decisions that could change the trajectory of her company. But there was more to it than that. Ava had a mission beyond just business. She wanted to build a legacy where people like her didn't have to fight for recognition, where they were already seen, already respected. She wasn't naive. She knew it would take time. But she also knew that it started with people like her who refused to be invisible, who stood up even when the odds were stacked against them. And today, as she sat in her seat, surrounded by strangers, she realized that she had done just that. She had made a statement, not with words, but with actions. And that, she knew, was the beginning of something bigger. As the plane began its descent toward New York, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges ahead didn't scare her. They fueled her. She wasn't just on a journey to a meeting. She was on a journey to change the world, one small step at a time. Ava stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. The contrast from the quiet altitude to the busy rush of the airport's terminal was jarring, but Ava had learned to navigate both worlds effortlessly. As she moved through the crowded hallways, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a message from her assistant, confirming her meeting with investors in 2 hours. Ava paused briefly, scanning the crowd around her before continuing toward baggage claim. She had just stepped off a victory, and she was determined to build on it. She knew that the situation in the airport earlier was just a small part of the larger fight, but every small moment, every victory, was a step in the right direction. It was a reminder that change was possible. As Ava waited for her suitcase, she couldn't help but reflect on her career. It wasn't just about the money or the prestige. It was about the opportunity to create spaces where people like her could thrive without having to constantly fight for their right to be seen. Her thoughts were interrupted as her luggage arrived on the conveyor belt. She grabbed her bag, adjusted the straps, and made her way toward the exit. A car was waiting to take her to the meeting, but as she walked through the terminal doors, she was struck by the noise of the city. The rush of the wind, the honking horns, the shuffle of busy pedestrians. It was all so different from the peaceful moment she had just experienced in the air. Yet, in a way, it felt like the perfect environment for what she had to do. Ava had always believed in the power of presence. In a room full of people, your presence could either silence or command attention. And in a city like New York, where ambition was king, Ava knew her presence meant more than just being there. She had earned the right to take up space. The drive to her meeting felt almost surreal. The towering buildings of Manhattan loomed over her, the streets teeming with energy. She thought about how she had once been intimidated by these very streets, how they had felt like an endless maze. But now, she knew her way. She had conquered the business world one step at a time. As the car pulled up to the sleek glass building, Ava felt a sense of calm wash over her. She was ready to prove that she belonged in this world, ready to fight for those who were still fighting for their place. As she walked into the building, she was greeted by the receptionist, who led her to the elevator. It was a familiar process, but today felt different. Today, Ava wasn't just another executive walking into a meeting. Today, she was a symbol of everything she had worked for, the kind of woman who could walk into any room, any airport, and demand the respect she deserved. As the elevator doors closed, Ava's reflection in the mirror stared back at her, strong, confident, ready. The meeting went just as planned. Investors were impressed, and deals were finalized. But Ava wasn't focused on the money or the success of the meeting. She was focused on the bigger picture, the change she was contributing to, the legacy she was building. When the meeting ended, Ava felt a wave of accomplishment. She was on her way to creating a future where people like her, people who had once been sidelined, could thrive, not just survive. It wasn't just about business. It was about breaking down the walls of discrimination, one step at a time. She left the building with a renewed sense of purpose. Ava had always known that she was destined for something greater, but now, more than ever, she could see the path clearly. The fight wasn't over, but every victory, every moment of defiance, brought her one step closer to the world she wanted to build. Ava stepped out of the sleek glass building, the weight of her accomplishments settling on her shoulders. New York had always felt like a city that never stopped moving, a constant whirlwind of energy, ambition, and opportunity. And now, more than ever, Ava felt connected to that pulse. She had walked through doors that had once seemed closed, had overcome barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. But today wasn't just about the deals she had signed or the recognition she had earned. Today was about something deeper. It was about what came next. Ava's car pulled up to the curb, and as she got in, she looked out the window, watching the city rush by. It had been a long day, but she felt invigorated. The road ahead was still uncertain, but that was part of the journey. She wasn't afraid of uncertainty. She thrived in it. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a message from her mentor. "You did great today. Keep pushing, Ava. The world is waiting for you to lead." Ava smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude. Her mentor had always believed in her, even when others didn't. Their words had been a source of strength during the toughest moments of her career, and now, they felt like a reminder of why she kept moving forward. As the car made its way toward her next destination, Ava's thoughts drifted back to the incident at the airport. She had been stopped, judged, and misunderstood. But she hadn't backed down. Instead, she had stood firm, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed based on assumptions. That moment was a turning point, not just in her own life, but in the lives of others who witnessed it. She had made a choice that day, to stand up, to be seen, and to challenge the expectations others placed on her. Ava knew that the work she was doing was about more than business. It was about breaking barriers, changing perceptions, and inspiring others to do the same. As the car pulled into her hotel, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. But even as she entered the building and took the elevator up to her room, her mind was already racing ahead. Tomorrow was another day, another opportunity to push the boundaries of what was possible. Ava was building a future where people of all backgrounds had the chance to thrive without facing judgment or discrimination. The elevator doors opened, and Ava stepped into her room. She set her bag down, walked to the window, and gazed out at the city below. The lights of New York twinkled like stars, each one representing a story, a dream, a possibility. She was a part of that now, and she was ready for whatever came next. Because Ava knew this truth. No matter the challenges, no matter the setbacks, she had the power to keep moving forward. And that, more than anything, was the key to her success. Ava sat at her desk the next morning, the soft light of dawn filtering through the blinds. The city was already waking up, the hum of traffic growing louder by the minute. She sipped her coffee, the warmth filling her, grounding her as her thoughts raced ahead. She had a full day of meetings ahead, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she had had with her mentor the night before. The world is waiting for you to lead. Those words resonated deeply with her. She wasn't just working for her own success. She was working to change the landscape for everyone who had been overlooked, undervalued, or judged by the color of their skin. Ava had spent years carving her path, and now, she knew it was about something much larger than just business. She had become a part of a larger movement, one that was shifting how the world saw people like her. She had seen firsthand how discrimination worked, how quickly assumptions were made about someone based on their appearance. But now, she had the power to rewrite those narratives. It wasn't going to be easy, and Ava knew there would be more moments of resistance. But she was ready. She had been tested in ways she had never imagined, and each challenge had only made her stronger, more determined. As Ava prepared for her first meeting of the day, she reviewed the notes on her tablet. She had been in the finance world long enough to understand numbers, to read people, and to make decisions that could impact millions. But this meeting, like many others lately, wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about positioning herself as a leader who understood the responsibility that came with success. Ava wasn't just building a company. She was building a legacy. She wasn't just working for personal gain. She was working for the change she wanted to see in the world. The meeting went smoothly, as she had anticipated. Her investors were impressed, but there was a deeper conversation happening beneath the surface. Ava was no longer just seen as a businesswoman. She was being recognized as a force for change. As the meeting concluded, one of the investors, a man who had once doubted her, leaned in and said, "I have to admit, you've earned my respect, Ava. You're not just running a company. You're running something much bigger. You're leading." Those words, simple as they were, held weight. Ava didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, allowing the moment to sink in. She had always known her worth, but hearing it from someone else made her realize just how far she had come. She had gone from being underestimated, dismissed, and doubted to being recognized as a leader in her field. It wasn't just about the accolades or the power. It was about the impact she was having. The meeting ended, and Ava made her way to her next appointment. As she walked through the streets of New York, the hustle of the city around her seemed to fuel her. Every person she passed was part of a larger story, a story that was being rewritten every day. She wasn't alone in her mission, and that realization made her feel more empowered than ever before. The journey ahead would be long, but Ava knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her purpose, and nothing could stand in her way. Ava had always believed in the power of moments. It wasn't the grand speeches or the flashy presentations that made a difference. It was the quiet, pivotal moments when everything shifted. And as she sat in the back of the car, heading toward her next destination, she couldn't help but reflect on the moment that had changed everything. The encounter at the airport had felt like an ordinary inconvenience at first, just another interruption in her busy life. But now, she realized, it had become something far more meaningful. It had been a lesson, not just for the officers who had judged her, but for everyone who witnessed it. She had stood tall, not just for herself, but for every person who had been marginalized, ignored, or underestimated. In the months since that day, Ava had seen a change in how people approached her. It wasn't that they saw her as some kind of hero. It was more subtle than that. They saw her as someone who could lead with integrity, someone who wasn't afraid to take on the challenges that came with being a person of color in a predominantly white world. It was the quiet shift in how people looked at her, how they treated her, and how they began to realize that their own biases had no place in the world she was building. Ava wasn't naive. She knew that racism didn't disappear with one confrontation, no matter how powerful it had felt. But she also knew that the smallest actions could create ripples that reached further than anyone could imagine. As the car continued to move through the busy streets of New York, Ava's thoughts turned to the people who had helped her along the way. The mentor who had always believed in her, the colleagues who had supported her from the beginning, and even the strangers who had watched her stand up at the airport. They had all played a role in helping her become the person she was today. Ava had come to realize that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about lifting others up, about inspiring them to reach their full potential. She had learned that true leadership came from showing up as your authentic self and being willing to take risks. Her meeting that afternoon was important, but Ava wasn't focused on the deal. She was focused on the bigger picture, the one she had been painting for years. She wasn't just building a company. She was building a movement. Ava stepped out of the car and into the lobby of the building, the same building she had visited countless times before. But today felt different. Today, she was no longer just a visitor. She was a leader, and she knew that her work was just beginning. As she walked into the conference room, the people around her stood a little straighter, looked her in the eye a little more confidently. They were beginning to understand what she had known all along. Leadership wasn't about power. It was about influence. It was about showing others what was possible when you refused to back down. The meeting went as expected, productive, insightful, and, as always, filled with opportunities to grow and evolve. But as Ava left the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made her mark, not just on the world of business, but on the people who would follow her. And that was the true measure of success. Ava stepped out of the building, the warm afternoon sun hitting her face as she took a deep breath. The city was alive around her. People hurrying to their destinations, the sounds of cars and conversation blending into the typical rhythm of New York. She felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her, not from the deal that had just been signed, but from the quiet understanding that she was making a real impact. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from her assistant, confirming a flight back home for tomorrow. As Ava looked at the screen, her mind wandered back to the conversations she had been a part of that day. It had been a significant one, many new projects, potential partnerships, and a clear path forward for the company. But beyond the business, Ava was realizing something deeper. She had created a ripple that was beginning to grow into something larger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had watched her rise, everyone who would now see her as a source of inspiration. As she moved through the crowded streets, a soft smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had always been confident in her abilities, but there was something different about today. It was as though the city, the world itself, was now looking at her with newfound respect. And it wasn't just the people in power or the investors she worked with. It was everyone. It was the strangers who would pass by her on the street and see her as more than just a businesswoman. They would see her as someone who had defied expectations, someone who had pushed through the barriers, and someone who was not afraid to speak her truth. Ava entered the car that was waiting for her outside the building and sank into the leather seat. She stared out the window, the city sprawling out before her like a canvas, full of potential and promise. The world was hers to shape. She thought about the conversation with her mentor that morning, the words that had stuck with her. "You're not just leading a company, Ava, you're leading a movement." And she knew, in that moment, that her mentor was right. It wasn't just the deal she was closing or the power she was gaining. It was the people she was influencing, the change she was creating. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been overlooked, who had been told they didn't belong, who had been underestimated. Ava had carved out a space for herself in this world, and now, she was helping others find their space too. As the car made its way toward the airport, Ava felt a deep sense of peace settle within her. She had been in constant motion for so long, always pushing forward, always striving for more. But today, she allowed herself to simply be present, to recognize how far she had come, how much she had accomplished, and how much further she was going to go. Tomorrow, she would board a flight back to her team, back to the people who had supported her from the beginning. But today, she took a moment to appreciate the journey. It wasn't just about achieving success anymore. It was about inspiring others to rise alongside her, to break through the walls of doubt and discrimination. Ava knew there was still work to be done. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. Because she understood now that the true measure of success wasn't just in the deals made or the titles earned. It was in the lives she touched, the stories she inspired, and the legacy she was building.